Morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Stories of Music. We're continuing our series on the history of Canadian rock. This week, we're looking at the 1960s. So, as you can imagine, there were some pretty big events that happened during the 60s that tended to overshadow most of Canadian music. Of course, early on, you had the British invasion, including, obviously, Beatlemania. Later in the decade, you had events like the Summer of Love in 1967, and of course, Woodstock and the hippie generation centered around 1969. Having said that, there were still some Canadian acts that did manage to make a name for themselves in the 1960s. Now, the popularity of a lot of the US rock artists on the Canadian music charts at the time, especially the Chum chart and the RPM magazine weekly chart, meant that a lot of Canadian artists, especially the country and folk artists, had to add a rock style to their repertoire. And they especially had to do this when you think that they had to turn to the United States to really establish their careers. Some artists that did go down this path would include people like Gordon Lightfoot, who we've mentioned before, Joni Mitchell, and of course Leonard Cohen. These are all acts that did manage to find an international audience in the 1960s. Another good example of this would be the group Chad Allen and the Expressions. They, of course, would evolve later on in the decade to become the Guess Who, very well-known Canadian band. Another one would be the Hawks, who we mentioned last week. They would spend a couple of years being Bob Dylan's backup band, and then they would go solo in 1968. They would, of course, be known simply as the band. Now, they're also a good example of a group that was mostly Canadian members, but of course they did also have Levon Helm as their drummer. He was born down in the States in Arkansas. Another good example of a band that went this route would be Steppenwolf. 2 out of the 5 members were Canadian-born, but you also had members like lead John Kay, who was German-born, but would actually become a Canadian citizen later on. They found their fame with songs like Born to be Wild and Busherman. Another artist in this vein would be somebody like Neil Young, Canadian-born, but of course found his fame with Buffalo Springfield, and then later on Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, only going solo later in his career using the group Crazy Horse as his backup band with songs like Ohio right at the end of the decade, which of course, being about Kent State shooting in Ohio, brings up another point. A lot of Canadian artists needed to find ways to establish themselves with American audiences. One other effect of that is that there wasn't really a distinctive Canadian sound for Canadians. That's something that would have to wait until the following decade, the 1970s, and an event that I personally think is one of the most important ever to occur in Canadian music, and that's something that we will talk about next week's Stories of Music when we do talk about the 70s. Thanks for joining us this week for Stories of Music, and we'll hope to see you next time. Bye for now.